Hello, everyone. As you slowly come in, please let us know where you're tuning in from. I am in the Hartford area. I'm not at the museum right now. This is a virtual background behind me, but it is a nice set of books that I have for my virtual programs. But yeah, so I'm near the house, but I'm not there. Let me know where you're tuning in from. Looks like we have about 30 people now, probably about halfway from where we should be. So we're just gonna wait for a few more seconds. Looks like we have someone from East Woodstock in the quiet corner of Connecticut. Bloomfield, not too far from the house. And Danbury. First non-Connecticut person from Essington, Pennsylvania. And Audubon, New Jersey. I'll just wait a little bit longer for people to arrive. Another person from Connecticut, from Milford. Glad to have you all here. Yeah, let us know where you're tuning in from. Oh, someone from Nevada. Excellent. Great to have you. Always good to have people from outside of the Northeast. Enfield. And I'll just let you all keep talking there in the chat, and I'll do my introduction. If this is your first time here, hi, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House Museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm delighted to host tonight's program, Empire of Ice and Stone, the Disastrous and Heroic Voyage of the Karluk. First, I need to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are very happy to honor his memory with these programs. And we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. As a nonprofit organization, the Mark Twain House and Museum depends on contributions to share our enriching author programs like Empire of Ice and Stone, as well as education initiatives and other events with our community. If you can, please consider donating, as they say on NPR or on PBS. Any donation is a big help. And I'll provide a link for that in the chat. So you can add your 5, 10, 20 more donation. Now, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's program. We are welcoming Buddy Levy and Deborah Blum for a discussion of Buddy's book, Empire of Ice and Stone, a new book about the true harrowing story of the ill-fated 1913 Canadian Arctic Expedition and the two men who came to define it. Our author, Buddy Levy, is the author of more than half a dozen books, including Labyrinth of Ice, The Triumphant and Tragic Greeley Polar Expedition, Conquistador, Hernan Cortez, King Montezuma, and the Last Stand of the Aztecs, River of Darkness, Francisco Orella's Voyage of Death, and Discovery Down the Amazon. He is the co-author of No Barriers, A Blind Man's Journey to Kayak the Grand Canyon, and Geronimo, Leadership Strategies of an American Warrior. His books have been published in 8 different languages. Our moderator, Deborah Blum, director of the Night Science Journalism program at MIT and the publisher of Undark magazine, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist, columnist, and author of 6 books, most recently The Poison Squad, a 2018 New York Times notable book. Now, we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat, If you have a specific question, you can post that directly into our Q&A section. So you can chat as much as you want in the chat, questions in the Q&A. Please also know that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. Actually, I have that in my little script, but I think it's changed since I last wrote this. So it might be on I think it's under more and then captions, and you can turn it on there. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, I will be putting a link to the chat to purchase Empire of Ice and Stone through our museum store. Your purchase will support our museum and our honored guest. So that is all from me. Please sit back and enjoy. This is going to be a really, really cool conversation. And I will turn it over to Buddy.
Hi, I'm Deborah. It's great to be here, and I'm super excited to be talking to Buddy about his book, The Empire of Ice and Stone. So let's just dive in, Buddy. Your book, in many ways, it's a fascinating story to me of human ambition and courage, fear and failure, heroism, and even hope. There's so many things that I'm looking forward to discussing, but it's also a story built on strong characters, like the two leaders of the Karluk expedition, Stephenson and Bartlett. And there's another character here, though, that I want to start with, and that's the Arctic itself. Your descriptions of place are so vivid in this book, and I thought it might be really interesting to begin this conversation by having you scene set for us a little. Take us to the Arctic. Read a little bit from your book in which you give us that dramatic sense of place that stands out in the book.
Sure, I would love to. And Deborah, thanks for agreeing to do this. I really appreciate it. And also thanks to Omar and to the Mark Twain House and Museum for inviting me. It's great to be here. And thanks to all you folks out there in the ether worlds for coming. I appreciate it. We both do. Yeah, so I view the ice pack, the polar pack, and the seascapes of that region a kind of what I would call a terrifying beauty. There are elements of the sublime, but the moving sea ice is also incredibly violent, and it can kill you at any time. And there's this haunting, captivating beauty, and at the same time, there's danger in every direction. So I'll just I chose a couple of short passages that'll give you a little flavor. Both take place while they're still drifting in the Karluk. Late that evening, McKinley went out to take in the skies and the air. Though it was minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, he did not feel cold. The glow of the full moon bathed everything in a lustrous light. He walked about 100 yards beyond the ship, the dry ice crunching beneath his boots, then turned around. Large hummocks of ice cast long, disfigured shadows, and the mounds themselves had been polished to a glassy sheen so that they shimmered like giant gemstones. Stars, muted by the flaming moon, flecked the cloudless sky, and auroral streamers hung down like shimmering curtains. He turned and took in the Karluk, which rose above the scene like an ice ghost, her rails and deck and rigging sheathed in glittering rime. All at once, McKinley grew aware of that presence again, a sense that he was not alone. It was something otherworldly, an exaltation beyond all earthly feeling. The feeling slowly faded away, but the memory was emblazoned in him. When he got back to his bunk, he wrote in his journal, "Whatever hardships the future might hold, whatever fate the North had in store for me, I felt supremely glad that I had come." And I will add before I read the next passage that he will soon have time to question that decision. I'll just put it that way. And this is McKinley also, who he wrote an incredible diary and journal of the experience. For a time, they sat motionless in a shallow slick of still water between leads. Leads are open water between ice flows. But then, imperceptibly at first, they started to drift. From the deck, McKinley was filled with a sense of awe and wonder at all his new experiences, at everything he was witnessing. He'd seen his first polar bear and walrus, his first ice blink, had climbed the rigging to the top of the mainmast and seen a spectacular mirage, the appearance of land towering hundreds of feet in the distance, but learned that it was an optical illusion, the result of temperature inversion and the bending of light. Now McKinley stood and watched the skies and surveyed the ice, mesmerized by its character, its power, its spectacular, unsettling sounds, sometimes cracking like gunfire, sometimes shrieking as it split and cleaved. Sometimes it seemed almost to have the throaty, guttural sound of an animal roaring as it came together or parted. As he watched and felt wind stirring, he sensed the ship begin drifting fast toward the northwest, once again away from their destination. Once he believed he could see open water to the east and thought that if they could somehow reach it, they might get clear, but not yet, not tonight. What he thought was open water was just another mirage. That evening, he felt minuscule and vulnerable, writing in his journal, "The ice tonight was being crushed everywhere badly, being reduced in most places to powder. It is a fascinating sight to watch the square mile of ice slowly moving together, while the noise of the breaking and raftering, almost terrifying one with the roar."
Those are such compelling descriptions. And when you read the first one, I had this moment where I thought, I'd love to go there. And then when you read the second one, I thought, oh, maybe I wouldn't actually love to go there. But you reminded me of a time that I did a reporting trip, a glacier reporting trip in Alaska. And there was a point where I thought, coming myself from what they call the lower 48, I thought this is like being on another planet, right? It's so alien to everything you know when you're grounded I'm in Massachusetts right now, when you're grounded in Massachusetts. So I love the way you take us there. Let me ask you this. How did you find this story? When I first saw the book, I thought, I didn't know this. I didn't even know about this ship. So tell us a little bit about, and I know you have done other books in this part of the world, but tell us a little bit about how you found this story and what drew you to it.
Sure. Yeah, it's a little bit circuitous, but in the intro, Omar mentioned this book that I wrote called No Barriers, which is about a blind man who was the first blind person to summit Mount Everest and to descend the entire length of the Grand Canyon in a kayak. And I was doing journalism about adventure racing, this strange sport. And I found out that this man, Eric Weinmeier, was going to be doing a race. This was in 2003, was going to be doing this race in Greenland. And I wanted to go there and see what it was like and how a blind person navigated kayaking through, fjords and trekking up mountains. And while I was there in Greenland, I met a woman named Ingrid, and she was a Norwegian who was very interested in Arctic exploration. And she gave me a book about Fridtjof Nansen's first crossing of Greenland. And at that point, I started just reading widely about Arctic expeditions. And I have to say, I was predisposed to them, having grown up in a ski town in Idaho. And my father was a Nordic ski racer and had been in the 1956 Winter Olympics. And he always revered the Norwegians for their exploratory nature and their toughness. And so I was sort of introduced to cold places and the interest in people skiing across cold places and being out there by my father too. But once I started reading about all these Arctic expeditions, that's when I came across the Greely expedition, which is the subject of Labyrinth of Ice. And during that period, I stumbled onto this story, some references to the Karluk and to the Canadian Arctic Expedition. But I was so immersed in Labyrinth of Ice that I ended up just putting it in a folder, as we do, and tucked it away. And when I finished it, my editor said, as editors will do, "What else you got?" And luckily, I had, I was really drawn to the story, and so I only had the thumbnail sketch of it at the time. And then once he asked me that, I dove in and started reading more and more. And the more I read, the more I was just drawn to all of the elements in this story. You know, it had so much. It has shipwreck and mutiny and maybe a murder and, you know, marooned on an island in the polar sea. It's just, and I was just smitten, really.
Smitten is a great word. And I realize I'm explaining things now for a moment slightly out of order, but if you haven't been to one of the Mark Twain House and Museum events, book events before, basically what's going to happen is that Buddy and I'm going to ask Buddy a ton of questions as a science journalist who finds this a fascinating subject, and probably for about half an hour or so. And then we're going to open it up to questions from you all. So if you have questions, we would love to hear them. You can put them in the Q&A, which you see there down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll look forward to everything you want to explore further. So I actually want to go back, Buddy, to the Arctic itself and that sense of the power and the danger of place, because it feeds into one of the things that I find uniquely, or maybe it's not unique, but interesting about the story of what happens with the Karluk. And that is things went wrong really fast. This wasn't a boat that was out there exploring for months before problems arose. It seems like, catastrophe loomed. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is that unusual? What happened?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And, it's true that in a lot of cases, the expedition gets further along. And I will say, this story goes south in the north very fast. And we'll get into a number of the reasons for that. But what is quite unusual is that, they have this small armada of ships in the Canadian Arctic Expedition, just 3 ships. And after they've gone from British Columbia, by the way, this is the Canadian Arctic Expedition in 1913 and organized by a man named Willimer Stephenson, or Willimer, some people say. And as they get around Point Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost point of Alaska, and then have plans to go rendezvous, they're struck by this is early August, and they're struck by what we would consider here to be, a violent winter storm, and it separates the ships. The Karluk, which is the flagship, is encased in ice, and it becomes nipped or beset, as they said in the day, which are sort of euphemisms for screwed, I think. They're really the ice encroaches all around the ship, and it's no longer able to move under its own power. It's essentially encased. And they're encased in about a square mile of ice, and they begin drifting away from shore out toward the Beaufort Sea and the Arctic Ocean, and it happens before they've even really gotten to their rendezvous point. And so it's unusual in that respect, because in a lot of cases, there's been some they've been able to go longer and achieve part of their goals, and so it really did disintegrate rather quickly. Now, I will add that at the point in August of 1913, when this storm hits, all is not completely lost yet.
Good to know. When I listen to you, I think, Debbie, there's a lot. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but I mean, there's a lot of risk in taking one of these creaky old boats, as I think of them, or ships out into the Arctic. I mean, the Arctic was dangerous. It wasn't a surprise that ice existed, right? What kind of person does, I mean, it would not be me, obviously, but what kind of person says, yes, I want to gamble my life on taking a small boat out into the kingdom of ice, as it were, and taking my chances out there? Is there something that really defines these kinds of polar explorers?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, you have to look. There's a couple ways to answer that question. I mean, one of them is that this expedition was a little bit different in that it was scientific in nature from the beginning. It was very ambitious in its scientific aspirations. On the Karluk itself, very few of these aspirations were met. But I want to add something about the craft because, the captain, who we'll get to in a bit in more depth, Robert Bartlett, was a very experienced sea captain and considered to be the world's greatest living ice navigator at the time. Now, he had just come back a few years before from captaining Robert Peary's grand SS Roosevelt, which was an iron-hulled ship designed for bashing through sea ice up through the Smith Sound and the Kane Basin and into, the top of Greenland and Ellesmere Island, Canada. And so, that was Robert Peary's North Pole expeditions. And, those they understood, like, we're going to go try to make it to the North Pole. And there was a mortality rate in the day of approximately 50%. So there was a pretty good chance if you signed up for one of these things that you weren't coming home. And I think the kind of people who were like Peary or expedition leaders who were seeking fame and glory and maybe patriotic immortality were a little different than the kinds of people who ended up on the Canadian Arctic Expedition, because, like I said, they were scientists from a whole bunch of different countries who weren't going to try to make it to the North Pole or achieve farthest north. They were going on a scientific inquiry. And then you have some regular crew members, and these crew members, were hired on, and often they were, they sort of understood, they were lifelong seafaring types, and they just were doing a job. But it's a good question because this expedition had lofty goals, though they weren't necessarily for discovery of a place where people had never been before, though they were in fact looking potentially for new lands. There had been rumors of a place that Robert Peary claimed to have seen, called Crocker Land. And one of the stated goals by Stephenson, the expedition leader, was to see if Crocker Land existed. And if so, then Canada could claim sovereignty of it and expand its empire, as it were.
So when you're describing the Peary expedition and the ironclad boat, that's not true of the Karluk. And one of the things that strikes me, right, this is not an ice cutter. Reading the story is that, yes, this is a dangerous environment, but the catastrophes that follow here, we can't all blame on nature. So let's talk a little about the human contribution to the problems that happened with the boat. Was the boat equipped? Was there a lot of planning that went into this expedition? Were they ready in all the ways that you would hope if you were going into a dangerous part of the world?
No, they were not prepared completely. And I will say that a couple of things happened that were really interesting. First of all, I mean, when Bartlett initially saw the ship, they left from Esquimalt, British Columbia, traveled up through the Bering Strait, and then convened in Nome. And Bartlett saw very quickly that the Karluk was, I mean, he certainly was, if comparing it to the Roosevelt, it was no such craft. But the Karluk is the Aleut word for fish, and it had a number of decades of good service in the sealing and whaling and salmon fishing industry. So it was good enough for that. But Bartlett immediately saw that it was underpowered. In fact, his chief engineer, John Monroe, said that its steam engine had about the power of an old coffee pot. Is how he described it. And then so Bartlett had the engines retrofitted, and also he had the bow sheathed in more wood for protection, knowing that they were going to be bashing against the ice. Stephenson he was quite hurried. The expedition leader was quite hurried in his putting together of this expedition. I mean, typically these things take years. He did it in a matter of months, and he had just, part of the reason was he had just come back from 4 years in the Arctic himself, but he was much better in small group organizational practices. This was really an elaborate, it had many scientists and thousands of pounds of gear and food, and so one of the things I really was struck by is that the plan was to take these 3 ships and then all convene at this place called Herschel Island, which is above the Canadian Yukon. And then he had the wrong members on the wrong ships and the wrong gear on the wrong ships. But his rationale was, when we get to Herschel Island, we'll reorganize everything. And you could really tell that Stephenson was distracted because of that 4-year trip I mentioned he'd just come back from. He took a separate ship from British Columbia up the Bering Strait to Canada, to Nome. And while he was on that ship, he had an assistant, his personal assistant, and an assistant editor from the Museum of Natural History, who were helping him to edit a book about his previous experience, which was going to be called My Life with the Eskimo. And so he was already thinking, okay, when I get back from this expedition, there's going to be a bestseller waiting for me with all sorts of financial reward. And, at the time, so instead of making sure that everything was in order and where it should be for this expedition, the Canadian Arctic Expedition, he was, let's say, distracted and a little frazzled. And it ended up that when they got there, Bartlett immediately noticed that not everything was as it should be. And he actually delayed the departure from Alaska because he wanted to make sure things were in better shape. And I'll also say that Stephenson had plans to pick up a bunch of skins for skin clothing, and this becomes really important later on. And so he, at Barrow, and by the way, the scientists and Bartlett and the members of the expedition were expressed concern in both in writing and in calling for meetings to say, it doesn't feel like everything is really well organized here. And Stephenson kept saying, we'll sort it out at Herschel Island. And it became kind of a refrain among the group, we'll sort it out at Herschel Island. The problem is they never made it to Herschel Island.
Right, that's right. In fact, one of the things that's really interesting in the book is you've got these 2 strong characters, Stephenson and Bartlett, both in their different ways leaders of this expedition. And one of the things in your book, or the key points in your book that I found interesting, is that once disaster strikes, and that's, as we discussed earlier, fairly soon in this particular voyage, they respond in very different ways, right? And could you talk a little bit about that? And from your own perspective as an author, I mean, as a nonfiction author myself, you think a lot about the characters involved and sometimes pass judgment on them, right? I used to actually lecture people in my books about how they were behaving, even while I was writing. So, oh, don't do that. Can you talk a little bit about these 2 characters and the way they diverge once things go bad, and what you think that says about each of them?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And we learn so much about them through their writing too, that in addition to reading just about, the nuts and bolts and the chronology of the story, each produced lengthy works after the fact, which you learn a lot about the character of the 2. Now you have to filter that through the lens of, what they're trying to do with their narrative, but you still learn a lot. But I will say that, let's start with Bartlett. I mean, what was interesting about him is that he was a man who was part of this seafaring family called he was a Newfoundlander from this family that were nicknamed the Bartletts of Brigus, Newfoundland. And they had famous sea captains, to his grandparent, his grandfathers, his uncles, and his own father were all noted seafaring men who had worked in the whaling and cod industries. And Bartlett started, he's captained his own ship at 17, and he's 37 at the time of the Canadian Arctic Expedition. So he's basically been at sea for the last 20 years, almost constantly. And he has a kind of leadership in his DNA, and he's also just come off of leading the North Pole expedition for Robert Peary. And like I said, he's considered the world's greatest living ice navigator, and had actually been recommended to Stephenson by Peary. And he had recently won the noted Hubbard medal, which he was only the third man to receive it. And it was the two before him were Peary and Roald Amundsen. So, he's among the sort of Goliaths of Arctic travel and exploration. When he, so I think there's a lot, he was a man who was revered, respected, but he also was kind of in certain ways, he was a regular guy. So he got to know his crew and the people on a ship really well. He took some of the younger members under his wing. He would allow them to come up into the crow's nest with him, and really was a tutor. And he just seemed to care a lot about people. In contrast, Stephenson surfaces when your question is like, how did they respond to disaster? Well, it strikes pretty quickly, and Bartlett is cool, and he doesn't panic, and he starts to make good decisions about what's going to happen because they begin drifting. And so then he puts everyone to tasks so that they don't, lose their minds and get cabin fever. He has them, doing fire drills and getting off the ship and skiing and really trying to stay busy. Now, Stephenson is a bit different. He's something of a lone wolf, and I look at him as kind of a chameleon or shapeshifter or something. But when things, when they become beset, Stephenson starts to get anxious. They're drifting away from the coast, and Stephenson hangs around for about a month. The ship ends up drifting for almost 5 months. And within a month, Stephenson says, I'm going on a caribou hunt. And they're at this point, they've moved around, but they've ended up about 10 or 15 miles from the coast of Alaska. And I think the way I look at it, it's sort of like his only chance to get off this ship. And it sort of felt like he wanted more than anything to be off the ship. And so he goes on this so-called caribou hunt under the premise that they need fresh meat to thwart scurvy. As it turns out, they already had many seals in storage, and they were set up pretty well or at least it seemed so, for meat. So it's a little dubious, his decision. There's also this sidebar where I realized that there was another reason. I'll sort of save that one. There's another reason that no one had really talked about in the research that I discovered of why he wanted to leave the ship. But as it turns out, he goes his own way. And what I found damning in certain respects was that he ends up leaving the ship, and they get separated because of another big storm. This is September of 1913. And at that point, Stephenson beelines it to the coast and immediately begins organizing a kind of separate, what he calls the New Northern Party, because he knows that this ship is going to be drifting for a long time. And he doesn't spend a lot of time trying to immediately contact the Canadian government and say, look, I've lost my flagship. He ends up waiting a little while, sending some information later that has to go by dog sled, knowing that by the time they get back to him, he's already going to have re-outfitted the expedition and then go to try to do the science, and then he sort of goes off onto the ice. So they handle it very differently.
And so, when I read it, I'm like, man, he's just abandoning these people, but partly maybe because he's so focused on his personal goals, right? That trumps actually being a responsible leader of the boat. I found that pretty interesting. And Bartlett, by contrast, really focuses on trying to keep people alive. He does some interesting, I was thinking, and maybe you could talk about this a little, Buddy, about the ways that as it became more and more clear that the boat might actually be in trouble, he starts taking proactive actions, right? Like moving things off the boat.
Yeah, so it's so much happens so quickly. The book essentially encompasses 1 year. And Bartlett, once they're drifting, one of the most haunting elements of this story to me is that, and Stephenson knew this too, but as they're drifting along, it was well known from expeditions by Fridtjof Nansen in the Fram, which is a famous Norwegian ship, and then also a ship called the Jeanette. It was well known what the polar drift general direction was, and there's not a lot to run into out there in terms of land masses, like a small island called Wrangel Island. And so Bartlett understands that there's a good chance they're going to be drifting for a really long time, and he begins to have exercises in which the crew take a bunch of stuff off of the ship and put it onto the ice, and also has fire drills where because fire was a big concern on shipboard, and so he wants to keep the men active and doing things and busy. And for a long time, some of the scientists are also doing dredging and doing some of the scientific work. They brought along all this equipment, but once he realizes that they're probably going to drift, and also that they may well be crushed, he begins having them take thousands of pounds of bags of coal off of the ship, other kinds of fuel, lumber to construct some buildings, food, thousands of pounds of food, all the dogs, and take them off and build kennels for them and snow houses so that they can be protected from the elements. And sometimes he has them, then he'll have them take some of that back on the ship. Ultimately, his preparations and ability to foresee that things were probably going to go in the way of being crushed. The haunting part is that as they're drifting along, knowing this, they're reading these ship logs from the Jeanette and from other journeys that met watery and icy ends. And so they're in the cabins and in the galley reading these stories about exactly where they're heading. And so you have these journal entries from some of the members where they think, okay, like all is probably lost, there's despair. But then Bartlett sort of shores up their morale by saying, look, we're going to have plenty on the ice. And then we have to just figure out what the next thing is going to be that we have to do.
Yeah, I admired that. But also, and one of the things I really like about your book, when we're talking about people who sort of stand out as, heroes are important in survival, are the Inuit and the Chukchi. I think that I'd love to have you talk about the role of the indigenous or native people in this story and why they were so important
Sure.
here and to polar exploration in general, I think.
You bet. At the time, it was becoming common to, and it's certainly from the Norwegians, and Peary had done it, to bring along hire Inuit hunters and sometimes families, because they didn't like to separate for long periods of time because they might be gone for years, to bring them along for their incredible skill in living in these environments. And so one of the things that Stephenson did that was really useful was that before they left Barrow, they hired a family of Inuit who were a man named Karluk, his wife Karluk, who was nicknamed by the crew Auntie, and their two children, Helen and a little who was 8 at the time, and Mugpi, a little 3-year-old girl, and then 2 other Inuit hunters. Well, 3 really, two left with Stephenson, and then Kataktovik, who stayed aboard. And, they were being called upon to run the dogs, navigate over frozen polar seas that were shifting, build igloos, and teach the Anglo members of the expedition how to build igloos, and then hunt seals, walrus, polar bears. I mean, the polar bears is kind of ironic because the polar bears in many cases were actually hunting them, but they would have to protect their dogs and themselves and take down polar bears. But also, Auntie was instrumental in this expedition in her incredible skill at sewing life-saving Arctic clothing. I mean, we're talking thick parkas with fur hoods, reindeer hide parkas, trousers, mucklucks made out of the hide of bearded seals, and mittens. And they even used, the intestines of the seals to make outerwear that was water repellent. And then Auntie was also incredibly skilled at using, every part of an animal, sustaining meals, because later on in the story that food scarcity becomes a really big problem. And her thrift and usage of every part of the animal, and also even the kids. I mean, they learn how to hunt in these very and jig for cod on Wrangel Island, and Karluk builds a skin kayak, and he's able to go out and hunt for walrus. And so, yeah, I posit that without them, without the Inuit that they brought along, and this is true of not only the Canadian Arctic Expedition, but of other expeditions, but certainly in this expedition, I think everyone would have perished without them.
And I think you and I talked about this before, but even when explorations extended to the Antarctic, some of the people like Amundsen, who had learned from the indigenous people in the Arctic, applied those lessons to the South Pole. Yes,
absolutely.
And were they really appreciated at the time? I mean, from our, it's easier, I think, from the perspective we have here in the 21st century to look back and say, wow, these people were so important and they must or should have been so valued. But were they valued?
That's a great question. I mean, I think among the explorers who understood their importance, and, many of them, I think if they understood their importance as leaders, the leaders knew we really need them. In the story of the Karluk, there's some residual resentment by some of the lesser educated crew members who have prejudices that they existed then. But I think if you look at the work of Peary and some of the other explorers, they understood quite well that, and even, they attempted to learn their language. William McKinley, a school teacher from Scotland on the ship, he had classes with Karluk's family where he's helping them with English and they're teaching him their language, because he understands we're going to need to communicate to survive. It sort of depended on the person, but Bartlett certainly did appreciate them, and many of the expedition leaders whose lives their hands were in appreciate them.
And I'm not going to give this away because there's so much good stuff in the book that I don't want to spoil every moment of it, but I think it's also fair to say that Stephenson had some interesting relationships with the native people. But I want to talk for a minute about survival, because you have people like Bartlett, you have other people engaged in trying to keep people alive, and yet the subtitle of your book references the disastrous nature of this particular expedition, and that's not just the fact that the book is destroyed by ice. That's the fact that not everyone survives. And I wonder, without giving away all of that story, if there's a particular loss that you think illustrates what goes wrong in that sense, how we fail to keep people alive when things go wrong.
Yeah, it's a really great question. This expedition, as I mentioned before, was not, in terms of whether it was a success or not. I mean, the success ultimately becomes the fact that anyone survives. And the part we didn't really touch on, but I think it's really important, is that once the Karluk is crushed, there's this ordeal across the broken polar sea to try to get the members to Wrangel Island, about 85 miles away. And there's an element of heroism that I think surfaces in people when they realize that my job now is to get these people, and I'm talking really about Bartlett here, is to get these people to safety and then do whatever I can to make it back to civilization so that we can get word to the rest of the world that they're marooned there, because there was no radio on the Karluk, so no one really in the world knows where they are. The difference between this expedition and lots of others, where you could measure success by whether they got to the North Pole or made it to farthest north or achieved, a summit or whatever it was. In this case, because all of those things are obliterated in the first month of the trip, then it becomes really a story about survival. And because of different choices that certain people make on the ship, and I mentioned earlier there was like a supposed mutiny, but it was really that some members decided to go their own way, and Bartlett lets them, and then things don't go that well for them, and then there are some other just human error where it's very difficult to navigate in these parts of the world, and so they get lost and stranded, and so all of that's going on simultaneously. So
I have other questions, but I want to make sure we have several really good questions here from the audience. I want to bring those up next, and then I'd like, if we have any time, to come back to my brilliant questions. So Jeff wants to know, buddy, if you visited any of these sites, and if you were there actually experiencing the locations in person, did it change the way you told the story?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have to say, I was in Greenland for a few weeks, and when I unfortunately did not go, I had planned to go to Wrangel Island twice, but I've been to northern Alaska numerous times. But when I really wanted to go to Wrangel Island, the problem was that my first trip that was set up to go there, COVID happened, and then they weren't doing trips. And the next summer, I was slated to go there and spend 4 nights on Wrangel Island, and Russia invaded Ukraine, and Wrangel Island is a Russian holding, disputed, but so the answer is unfortunately no, not to Wrangel Island, but I have been to, and I haven't been to Siberia either. That was going to be part of the trip. But I was pleased to know that there are some folks that I know really well from northern Alaska, some really noted explorers, one of whose blurb is on the book, and he told me that, based on my time in Greenland, that I got the ice right. So I was really pleased to hear that.
That's terrific. And Jim wonders, once you've compiled all your research, what does your writing process look like? You've done everything, and now you're going to sit down and write the book. Do you have a particular method to that?
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's mostly a kind of a slog. That's how do I do it, though, is, to do most of the research on the front end. And then once I feel like, okay, I got to start telling this story because I have a deadline, then I start drafting, and then I typically print whatever I've written that day, take it home, read it again, and do some early editing. And then I just lock in. Unfortunately for me, my summers, because I'm still in education, my summers are when I have most of the time to do the writing. So I tend to lock in. And the good news is that the days are longer, so I can, spend 6 to 8 hours working on the book, go for a bike ride, do some editing in the evenings, come back in the morning, and then hit it again. And it's usually a pretty straight through kind of many months long marathon slog. And then I have some key readers that I give drafts to before I ever send it to my editor. And they're usually really, some of whom I've known for 30 years, so I trust them.
Do you plot it out in advance? I mean, I have friends who do charts and maps and index cards and all kinds of things, trying to figure out how all the pieces fit together, or do you just sit down and write?
Yeah, well, the thing about nonfiction that I like is that I usually write a proposal to begin with, so I have a general notion of the narrative arc. I like to tell my fiction writing friends, some of whom are impressed with my productivity, that I have the distinct advantage of knowing how the story is going to end.
Yes.
And so, but you always find these things along the way that you hadn't encountered before, especially in their journals and diaries. And I did want to say that that's one of the most rewarding and also thrilling parts of this, is that you're reading many of the stories, at least the two Arctic-based stories that I've written so far, have a lot of journals that were saved. So you get this real-time experience of what it was like, and I'm always so struck by them, slogging across the polar ice for 17 hours, building an igloo, and then under the limited warmth of a Primus stove, scribbling with pencil in notebooks for hours, or sometimes it's just, a dispatch. But because these expeditions were the ones that I've been writing about, had a science base, they often were concerned with things like temperature and wind speed, and they had thermometers. And so you're getting really good descriptions daily of what it was like out there, which really aids in the process. But yeah, I kind of have it mapped out in my head, and then as I encounter new things, I make adjustments about, let's say, a character. In this case, there's a Norwegian guy who I didn't know was going to be so important, named Bjarne Mammen. When I wrote the proposal, I didn't know how much I was going to I hadn't read his entire 200-page diary. And then you start seeing, wow, this guy is really, I have to front load this person and make him a really important character, because he was, and I just didn't know it in the proposal phase.
Yeah, I really like those kind of elements that come out of nowhere. I have a question from Pat about scurvy, saying that, meat is not necessarily useful for scurvy. We're talking about vitamin C. So in 1913, why were they so focused on fresh meat?
Well, that's an interesting question, because of the fact that I don't really buy Stephenson's rationale there, because they also did bring, on shipboard, you could have great quantities of citrus fruit and juices, which they did. But it looks like, there's information and research that suggests that there's enough, if you eat enough quantities of fresh meat, that you can thwart scurvy for a time. So yeah, it's kind of a conundrum, especially insofar as what Stephenson's reasoning was for it.
I don't know this, but I do know, there's my geeky science journalism background, that humans are the only mammals that don't make vitamin C, and every other mammal actually does make its own vitamin C. So it might be that in some muscles or parts of the body there would be some traces of vitamin C related to what you were eating, but I'm only speculating there. I don't actually know. Does the book have maps?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And front matter has maps.
Good. And then I have one last question before I come back to something that I really want to bring up with you from Jeff. Was this voyage done purely for exploration? You addressed this a little, but I think he's curious about the goal of the Canadian Arctic Expedition. Or was there a goal, like, for instance, finding a Northwest Passage or something that would really put Canada ahead?
Right. Well, the stated goal of trying to find out if this Crocker land existed would have been a big coup. And I won't tell you exactly what happens, but yeah, they weren't trying to discover any new. Well, I mean, you could make the case that they were trying to fill in some blank spots on the map because there were parts of the area north of the Canadian Yukon and Alaska that had not been fully mapped. And so, but they were also, I mean, it was really ambitious. They were doing marine, terrestrial, anthropological work. One of the things they were going to do was live among the people there and study their languages, because it was going to be like for 4 years. And some of that stuff, and I give it somewhat short shrift in the book because my interest ends up with Bartlett and the Karluk. But I will say that the Canadian Arctic Expedition, from a scientific standpoint, was not a failure. They came back with the Southern Party, this other part of it, comes back with quite a bit of amazing research, and they did discover 3 or 4 islands that had not been known to exist, and yeah, so they found out, or they made discoveries. They just weren't of the kind like going to the North Pole.
So my last question, and I know we're almost out of time, is based in part on the fact that I write science history. I'm interested in history. And so what I'd like you to address, from the perspective of the storytelling you do in this expedition, why do these stories of the past matter today? What do they tell us about how we got to here, even who we are? Why do they still resonate for us today, buddy?
Sure. That's a great question. And usually that's the question that your editor asks you. I think in a lot of ways, history serves as a kind of database of human behavior, human survival, innovation, and problem solving. And, we get to see how people manage in dire circumstances, who surfaces as leaders, who becomes the heroes and villains, and why. And I think we can learn a great deal from these stories and apply those kind of lessons to today. How would we react? I think when I'm reading these stories, I think, like, what would I do? Would I be more like Bartlett? Would I be more like Stephenson? Would I, particularly in this story, as they're marooned on Wrangel Island, I think it becomes a kind of Lord of the Flies on ice, and it's like, and we're drawn to those sorts of situations when people are thrown together. But there's also, I think, a real practical takeaway in Arctic stories in particular. There are a number of really practical takeaways. If you look at the science garnered, I mentioned the book I wrote called Labyrinth of Ice about the Greely expedition to up top of Ellesmere Island. And that was also, a scientific expedition, which Greely and his members took thousands and thousands of readings, everything from wind speeds, magnetism, the expanse and thickness of the polar ice, water temperatures, and this was in 1881. And so, remarkably, most of this information made it back. And so, organizations like NOAA are still using this today as a comparative database for, it's essentially proves that climate change and global warming exist, and we can look at the numbers from a little bit over 100 years ago and say, well, this is happening, and what are we going to do about it? And there, I think there's some psychological takeaways too when I read history, and specifically in Arctic stories. If you look at members of expeditions that are thrust into close proximity under duress, and then you add something like what's called the long night or the polar winter, where the lights go off for like 4 months. And, there are studies that look at, how members of these trips handled it, what drove them to things, and we can, reflect on things like seasonal affective disorder, and then look at the kinds of things that people did to controvert these conditions. And, people like Commander Greeley and Bartlett understood that you've got to keep them busy. And I read that they were, there's a book by a guy named Julian Sancton, his great book called Madness at the End of the Earth, about the first overwintering on the Belgica in Antarctica. And what drew him to the story actually was that he was reading that NASA was looking at, because a number of these expedition members on this ship, not unlike those on the Karluk, essentially lose their minds. And so they were, because we're going to be sending astronauts off to Mars potentially, and then we look at what happens to people when they are in such close proximity for months on end, and having to deal with those circumstances. So those are some of the reasons that I think these stories resonate today.
It's completely fascinating. And the book is really fascinating. I want to say congratulations to you, and such a compelling, addictive read. Unfortunately, we are out of time. But you've been terrific. Thank you. And terrific audience. Great questions as well. And thank you, Omar, and to the Mark Twain House Museum for having us here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Deborah, and thanks so much, buddy. Definitely added your book to my list. Once I get through all the books I have, but it's on the list.
I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you. And thank you so much to our audience. If you want to buy Buddy's book, you can do so through our museum store. I put links in the chat. But since we are going to close up soon, just go on the website, click on shop, and then event books, and you will find them there. You will find Buddy's book there. You can also join us for other free virtual programs. You can join us this Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when Mark Dawidziak will discuss his new biography of Edgar Allan Poe. And you can join us on March 28th. That'll be in a little over a month, when Dean King will discuss the story of John Muir's journey to become the man who saved Yosemite. So that is all from us. Thanks again, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out.